If you are rich enough, can you get away with murder? That's the question the 2016 documentary team Foxcatcher raises, and it doesn't quite have an answer for it. I'm going to talk about the documentary, but mostly I'm going to talk about the situation the documentary details. And one note, if you are a person who writes Wikipedia articles, please rewrite that article because it is the shortest article I've ever seen about a story that's so interesting. So, what happens is John Dupont is born. I forget when, it's not important because he ends up being a murderer, but he's born sometime in the last century, in the earlier part of the last century, and he has a very privileged upbringing on the one hand because he's one of the most wealthiest children in America, but on the other hand, it's really disadvantaged because his dad divorced his mom when he was 3, and he had a nanny who would feed him until he was 13, and he didn't play with a lot of other kids because this was around the time also of the Lindbergh kidnappings, and it's not mentioned in the documentary or any of the sources, but I feel like rich people would have been cut off from different elements of society anyway, but they would have been much more concerned about their security after that. So, anyway, he grows up and he goes to different schools and he actually becomes something of a scientist and he founds different museums because he's rich and he becomes an ornithologist and he discovers, I think, 20 species. So he does contribute to scientific understanding of the world. And if that was the end of the story, that would be fine. But, like a lot of rich people, he doesn't have a lot to do in his life, especially when he gets older. There is a brief moment where he gets married for 6 months, but the woman he gets married to runs away, basically because she says that he pulled a gun on her. And this is crazy. So, back to my original question. I don't think that you can get away with murder if you're rich, but I think you can get away with a lot of the things that lead up to murder. So, again and again in DuPont's life, there were moments where the authorities should have stepped in and done something, but because he was so rich, they were like, oh yeah, he's just being eccentric. So that was the first time in about 1986. So around the time, because his father was really big into equestrian sports, because, rich guy from that kind of generation. So he also was really into the pentathlon and eventually into freestyle wrestling. So he supported some, he supported pentathlon teams, and also he became really involved in amateur wrestling. Not the kind that you would see on WWE, but like the Olympics kind of wrestling. And he had this dream that America could be like a great wrestling power. So he basically built a commune on his estate and invited a bunch of wrestlers onto it so that they could train and be part of his team called Team Foxcatcher. That was the name of his father's stables. But they had they had uniforms, they had a logo, and it looked pretty cool. I'm not sure if he designed that or paid somebody to design it. Yeah, so there was all of this investment in this wrestling, and there were really quite important and talented wrestlers there. Like most of the best wrestlers in America were on this team, like David Schultz, Mark Schultz, and surprisingly, Kurt Angle, but we'll get back to Kurt Angle. If you don't know Kurt Angle, he was a former what was he? He was a former gold medalist in wrestling, and he's also a former WWE superstar. And he was also in on Team Foxcatcher. And as I said, we'll get to him in a moment. But this situation with all of these wrestlers living there, on the one hand, had like a lot of advantages, but had a bunch of disadvantages because John Dupont was a very eccentric guy, like eccentric leaning into like the criminal aspects because he was a rich guy and nobody ever said no to him. So there was the thing that happened with his ex-wife that's not mentioned in this documentary. But some things that are mentioned in the documentary is that he would drive around this area and he kind of made friends with, he didn't make friends because John Dupont didn't actually have any friends. But he had a lot of support because he would make acquaintances with people and then he would give them what they wanted because he's rich. So he did this with the local police. He set up like a shooting range that they could come to and use, and they would have like annual hunting parties on the estate. You know, so if you're like a little guy living in rural Pennsylvania, I think it's Pennsylvania, and you wanted to go hunt some deer or something, like you didn't really have to put out a lot of effort to do that if you were on the police force. So he maintained these relations. So back to what he was doing that was illegal, he was driving around this local area and he was shooting at wildlife from his car, right? Kind of weird because he was really a conservationist on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think he had a lot of demons. He did another thing, like he drove his car into a pond, which is not illegal, it's your car, but then there was somebody who was the president of the Wrestling Federation of America, and he drove into the pond again. So that's kind of attempted murder, right? It is, you know, so there was no repercussions. And later, the sort of instigating events of this situation happen. So DuPont is this really kind of insecure guy. On the one hand, he's really generous, but on the other hand, he's really odd. And there's like videos of him just saying like weird random things. He doesn't know how to interact with people. And on the one hand, he inspired a lot of loyalty from other people, but other people were like just kind of sucking up to him so that they could have some, I almost said something really bad, but they were sucking up to him so that they could get things from him. Like he would do this thing where he was obviously spiraling into paranoia and he'd be like, do you see that? Do you see that? And some people would be like, oh yes, of course, John, I see it. And the people who were his true friends, I think he only had one true friend in his life, who was David Schultz, which is going to be horrible in a moment. So David Schultz would say, no, I don't see that. What are you talking about? So what happened is there was another wrestler who was living on the property who was friends with David Schultz because, you know, wrestling community is a very small community. Friends with David Schultz. And DuPont wanted him off the property for whatever reason. Because what would happen is DuPont would become obsessed with somebody and then, I don't know, get bored and then move on to somebody else. Like it was Dave for a while. It was this Bulgarian wrestler for a while, to such an extent that he claimed that he was, he had Bulgarian heritage and he was Bulgarian. And that's crazy because DuPont is one of the most famous French families, and a person in the documentary mentions that, like, yeah, that's why you know the DuPont family, because of the appliance company. They had like invested in ammunition companies and during the First World War. I think that's where they made most of their money. They owned Remington. They owned like all a bunch of these things. So now there are like this generational wealth. Anyway, so DuPont kind of got obsessed with this guy, and then it turned really quickly, and then he was like, you have to leave the property, I don't like you anymore. And the guy, they moved all of their lives onto this property, so they had like all of this stuff that they had to take, and so he was going slower than expected. And DuPont came with a gun and basically like, you're gonna leave now. And then he's like, okay, I'm gonna leave. So he gets his stuff. I'm not sure if that particular wrestler had a family there or not, but anyway, he gets his stuff and he leaves. And I guess he borrowed Dave Schultz's truck to do this moving. So he brought the truck back, or he left his truck there or something. So he left it at Dave Schultz's house on this property. And this caused DuPont to think that David Schultz was the person who was behind all of his problems. And there were some really weird things, like he thought that Schultz had created a tunnel and that there were people behind the walls. And he hired like this private security guy. And instead of just saying, it's ridiculous, there's nobody hiding behind the walls, because this guy is like so rich and you're getting a lot of money, you're like, oh yeah, let's dig up the property and let's see if there's any bunkers here. Let's drill into the walls to see if there's anybody there. And it just kind of fed into his paranoia. So when he saw this guy's truck in David Schultz's, driveway, it was just a breaking point. And it's kind of crazy because I read an interview that's quoted on the Wikipedia page for DuPont, because DuPont's Wikipedia page has a lot of stories about this situation. And there's a lady who was like, no, I can't imagine that he would ever do that. He must have changed. And meanwhile, this whole documentary is talking about the fact that it is 100% predictable what's going to happen. So DuPont gets angry at Schultz, and he goes over to confront him, and this other wrestler is there, and they are like so DuPont takes his gun, and he's like very drunk and high, and he goes over and he's gonna have a confrontation, but he's like 65 or something, and he falls down the stairs and he injures himself. And Schultz and this other guy are kind of laughing it off because they're like, big tough wrestlers and stuff. And anyway, DuPont, he gets in his mind that those wrestlers attacked him and that one wrestler needs to go to prison. So he calls the local cops, he calls the state troopers, and the state troopers come and they do an investigation, and they're like, I'm not sure if it was state troopers, some police come and they do an investigation, and they're like, what happened? And Schultz and the other guys say, well, DuPont came and he was angry and he was drunk and he was high and he fell down, which seems likely, knowing what DuPont was like, that happened. And the police were like, okay, that makes sense. But they didn't do anything because, it is a crime to threaten somebody's life in most countries. It's definitely a crime in America to threaten somebody's life. But because DuPont is so rich, they're like, oh yeah, he's just eccentric. And I guess there was another situation where there was a similar thing where he was threatening somebody with a gun. So one of the wrestlers called the police, and the police told him, it wasn't this situation, I think, but the police told him like, oh yeah, DuPont is just eccentric. No worries. He's harmless. If somebody threatens another person with a gun, they're not harmless. Okay, because they have a gun. Like if I threaten somebody with a banana, and I'm using this arm with my injured elbow, and I try and hit somebody with a banana, maybe I'm harmless then, but you should still kind of do an investigation, because it's not normal to threaten somebody with a banana, and it's not normal to threaten somebody with a gun. So they don't do any investigation. and DuPont is just stewing in this paranoia and the cocaine and the drinking and the lack of friends. And so one morning he wakes up and he's driving his car with his like security guy, and he sees David Schultz he takes out his gun. And because DuPont is not this great athlete, but he did train pentathlon. He does know how to shoot a gun. He can do it, right? Kind of skillfully. He shoots David Schultz 3 times. Just randomly, without any provocation. David Schultz is on the property. He's on the property. Bang, bang, bang. David Schultz dies. Then, and this is when the story gets kind of even more crazy, because David Schultz dies. It's clear what's happened. There's a witness in the car. And he's like, stop the car. Why did you do that? And he gets out and he kind of runs to Schultz to see if he's okay. And then like his wife was there. His kids were there. So there's witnesses who know what happened. Like, it's not a question of who did it. David Schultz was murdered by DuPont. One thing I didn't mention earlier, which is probably important to the story, is that David Schultz was one of the best American wrestlers, and he was training for the 1996 Olympics, which would be shortly held thereafter. And his wife wanted them to leave because the situation in this team Foxcatcher was getting worse and worse. And he's like, no. I'm going to qualify for the Olympics, and I'm going to go to the Olympics. I'm going to win a gold medal, and then I'm going to retire, and we can go to California. So basically, he just wanted the possibility to complete his career, and he thought that he could do it, and he thought that DuPont and him were friends, because as I said before, David Schultz was DuPont's only real friend. He was the only wrestler who kind of really cared about DuPont. Others were just there for the money. And, so then DuPont locks himself in his house for 2 days, and the police are trying to negotiate with him coming out of the house. And he is a 65-year-old man who, yeah, he does have a lot of guns, so it might be dangerous to go in the house. But on the other hand, he just murdered somebody on his property. And they call him, and he's saying all these weird, crazy things, probably trying to set up some kind of insanity plea. Like he says he's the president, he says he's the Pope, whatever. But they're like, yeah, okay, all right, well, wait. But imagine if a normal person went and shot their best friend on their front property and then barricaded themselves in their house. It wouldn't last very long. There'd be tear gas, the house would be destroyed, and that person would be dead or arrested, So it's just like the cherry on the pie of hypocrisy when it comes to American society. John Dupont was this rich guy, so he got all of the breaks except the emotional breaks, and that's what caused him ultimately to break. And then there's other things that they talk about that are crazy. So John Dupont, before this happened, he developed this fear of black, and he said it was black was the color of death. So his dad, as I mentioned, had all of these thoroughbred horses. We had really expensive horses, so he got rid of all the black horses. He got rid of all of the black cars that the wrestlers had. And you can imagine that some of the best wrestlers in America who were on Team Firefox were also black. And he's like, we need to get rid of them too, because they're also unlucky and they're harbingers of death. So he had the American wrestling community in his hands, and they had a meeting about this. And, because it looks so racist that if you're kicking off all of the black wrestlers from this team, and they're like really surprised because they had like this chance to go to the Olympics and, you know, establish American dominance in that you know, in that sport. So they have like this meeting with all of the most important people in American wrestling, you know, like the president of the association and David Schultz. And basically, a lot of people want to pull the support from Team Foxcatcher and say, we're not going to take your money anymore, DuPont, because, you know, you've crossed a line. And they had like this argument on the phone for like 3 hours, and David Schultz was the guy who was like, you know, I live here, my kids are here. If I thought that DuPont was really a problem, I would leave. And that's when loyalty really blinds people to the danger that they're in. Because so I think that the story is kind of like two things. One is the connection between rich people getting away with a lot of stuff that DuPont's life shows, and the other is just this loyalty that Schultz had. So what happens is that Schultz gets killed, and there's a trial, and a lot of people kind of abandon Team Foxcatcher, obviously, because why would you still want to be a part of that? But a lot of people don't. A lot of people stay. It's like 50-50 because these wrestlers, they're financially dependent on this guy who was a murderer. And I'm not sure how that worked. How did they still get paid? I guess DuPont had a lot of support staff who was handling all of this stuff, I guess. And I don't know what happened with Kurt Angle, but he was a member of Team Foxcatcher. I'm not sure if he was a member at the time of this, but he went on to become an Olympic World Championship in 1996, which is the Olympics that Schultz would have been competing in. So indirectly, he won those Olympics because Schultz was murdered. You know, and I don't think that he ever thought like that, but imagine if he did. Oh, geez, it's so rough. Because on the one hand, you did dedicate all of your life to this sport, and you want to be at the pinnacle of it, but your way there is made a lot easier by circumstances that you can't, like, you don't have any responsibility for the fact that John Dupont went crazy and nobody cared. Yeah, and he did a lot of other weird things. Like after he was in prison, he ordered all of the buildings on the property to be painted black, which is odd because of his choices earlier. Then they talk about this in the documentary about how he wanted to be a wrestler like the other wrestlers, but these are wrestlers who are in their prime. They're some of the best wrestlers in the world, you know. And he's not even on an amateur level of wrestling. So he started this new division. I forgot what it was called, like classic division or something, veteran division for people over the age of 55 when they can wrestle. And they did find people who were able to wrestle over the age of 55, but they probably were wrestlers when they were younger. So, you know, they had the wrestle bodies, they had the wrestling talent, and they were paid to lose to John so that John could have a championship and feel like he was a good athlete. And it's kind of ridiculous because you can see, so they have some images of John wrestling people who are not being paid and losing badly, like being just thrown around and all of the motivation leaves his body. And then you see him wrestling people who are paid to lose, and it's like, oh, because they're not great actors, they're just wrestlers. So you see, yeah, completely faked. And he really believed that he was, you know, doing so well. And that's the problem with really, really big wealth gaps, is the really rich live in this reality where people who are not so rich, because they're dependent on them, are afraid of saying the truth to them. So That's really bizarre. So the documentary is an interesting examination of that, and I think it's from the time when Netflix was actually good at true crime. So if you like true crime, check out that documentary. It's called Team Foxcatcher. But I'm going to say a few more things about John Dupont before I finish because, this just annoyed me so much. So as I said, on John Dupont's Wikipedia page, there is a bit about the murder and what happens, and there's interviews with people. I think that it's kind of put in a very... It's attempting to be neutral, but then there are quotes which are very pro DuPont, like that lady I mentioned where she's like, oh, this is completely out of character. And then there's another guy that's quoted who says that John DuPont's paranoia started when he hired this private security guy, and that probably did not help. But it's not like he was so stable before then. But the most annoying part about it is that it says John DuPont, and then it, gives his vitals, birth and death date, and then it's like John DuPont, and then it's philanthropist, and then stamp collector, bird scientist, but more official, snail scientist, and then the last one is murderer, right? Like, I could understand when we're talking about complicated figures how we kind of forefront the accomplishments that they did rather than talking about the things that they did, the bad things they did in their personal life. So when you fire up, I don't know if you fire up a Wikipedia page, but when you fire up a Wikipedia page for Pablo Picasso, you're going to get all of his accomplishments first, and then probably somewhere along the line there's going to be his relationships with women, because Pablo Picasso was a very influential artist. And yes, as I said, John DuPont was a scientist, and he did discover like 20 bird species, but he's not the most renowned bird scientist in the entire world. His bird science career was like this. His stamp collecting was like this. And his murder like this. That's the most important thing to talk about John DuPont. And it's crazy because they talk about the fact that John DuPont owned the most expensive stamp, and then it was auctioned after his death. And that section is just as big of a part of the Wikipedia page as the murder is. So that's why I think somebody should go back and do the Team Foxcatcher Wikipedia page some justice, because it doesn't look... It's not a great look when... It's not even glorifying murderers. And I don't really know why the Wikipedia page is like that, because nobody cared about John DuPont when he was alive. And he did all of these things so that people would care a little bit about him. And the only person who I think genuinely cared about him, he murdered. Full stop. Put John DuPont, murderer. And then talk about the murderer, talk about the tragedy that was, and then talk about all the other stuff. Oh, that was so annoying. So made me angry, as you can tell. Okay, last thing, because I'm rambling, but the last thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of insanity as a plea against crimes. And I think that they did it very well in this case, because they said that he was mentally unstable but legally culpable, because he made a lot of those decisions that led to that murder. And even if he was high and drunk when he shot David Schultz, like still going around threatening people, saying that you're going to kill everyone. You know, it's not a stable thing to do, and you have a choice, right? Yeah. All right, this is the story of how one of the richest man and the only member of the Fortune 500 or 400, I don't know, whatever, to be convicted of murder. So that's interesting. John Du Pont, who killed his best friend David Schultz, robbing David Schultz of the chance to be a father for the rest of his life. So yeah, murderer. John Du Pont, murderer. Period. All right, that's my review of Team Foxcatcher and John Dupont, apparently. If you like what I do, please subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to be the most prolific reviewer of all time, and the only way I can do that is to get people to subscribe, and that subscription still, I guess, does something. It, promotes my videos in your feed, and it shows other people. It shows YouTube that other people might like the videos. I'm trying to get to 10 subscribers by the end of June, so I think it's a completely doable thing. And if you have some thoughts about this murder, put it in the comment section. If you like this video, even though I rambled a bit, click the like button. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.